All right, good morning, everybody. This is Barnyards and Backyards Live. Happy to have you all with us once again. Um, I'm Jeff Edwards. I am an educator for the University of Wyoming, and I'm located in Goshen County. And my co-host today is Jeremiah Vardaman. He's an extension educator up in the Powell Cody area. Our guest today is Chris Hilgert. Welcome, Chris.
Good morning.
Chris is the Master Gardener Coordinator and horticulturist for the University of Wyoming. So I believe that we are talking about irrigation today.
Yeah, you guys invited me to come in and talk about watering. And I said, well, I water lots of plants as a gardener, so we can talk about that.
Well, before we get any further, I would also like to mention that the person in the background is Jenny Thompson. She's an extension educator for the University of Wyoming as well. And she is our technical person trying to kind of keep us in line and make sure that everything is functioning correctly. For those of you who are new to Zoom, if you use your mouse and scroll over the top of the meeting itself, you will see a couple of boxes at the bottom. It's either Q&A or chat. If you have questions that you would like to ask us, any of us, about today's topic, please enter those comments or questions there. If you are watching along on Facebook Live, go ahead and enter your questions into the comments section in Facebook, and Jenny will be perusing those and pushing them forward to us. And I think I'm good. We've done introductions, we've done rules and regs. So Jeremiah, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and you can start questioning Chris.
Sure. I think we're all set. So yeah, Chris, how do we get started right now this time of year with irrigation? So for myself up here in Park County, we've had a beautiful weekend. It's hot, 60-degree weather. It might not be that way in Laramie. So how do we start deciding when to turn the irrigation on, what irrigation and that for our gardens?
Well, first, Jeremiah, I will say, even in Laramie, I may have read it wrong. I rubbed my eyes and looked at it a couple times because I thought the forecast said 75 for tomorrow. So it's even warming up here at 7,200 feet. So yeah, I mean, plants will, if we have that warm weather for, continued, a couple, 2 or 3 weeks, we are going to start to see our plants waking up. I mean, my grass is greening up. I haven't seen buds breaking on trees yet here in Laramie, but if this warm weather keeps up, we'll definitely see that. And then that means that, plants are going to start using a lot more water. And then we also start thinking about planting our gardens and planting trees and flowers. And so, of course, those are going to need additional water as well. But how do you get started? It depends on what you're watering. You should be watering your trees, particularly your evergreens, year round. So winter watering with spruce and juniper and pines can be really important to help them survive our long winters. And then, other plants that are coming out of dormancy this time of the year. We've had some wet snow and we've had some spring rains that have helped. But as things warm up and dry out, that's when we want to start providing some supplemental irrigation to those plants.
Right. So getting back to the evergreens, you made a comment that we want to irrigate those year round. Is that always feasible? Is that always possible to do that?
Well, you got to work with nature, right? If the hose is frozen, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to drag it out and try to turn the water on outside.
That's why you have to drain that hose every single time but when you unhook it, drain it, put it away, whatever, and then when you bring it out, you can turn your water on.
Don't fight it too hard, right?
Right.
When able to water, maybe try and get the hose out and water it when possible, but don't. I guess I always tell people, don't jeopardize the pipes, right? Don't freeze the pipes. Don't freeze your house pipes or the frost-free hydrant. It's not worth it.
Don't do that. But if you do have some thaws during the winter where we have some 40-degree days, or, and the snow melts, you can go out on a day like that and hand water your trees and shrubs, and particularly you focus on your evergreens during the winter months. So if you can do that once a month, great. Sometimes the weather allows you to do that, sometimes it doesn't. But if we have that snow cover, the ground is frozen, and watering wouldn't do a whole lot of good for those plants anyway.
Chris,
Great.
if you have a mature tree and the only way to get out there and water it is with a 5-gallon bucket, would you do it?
A mature tree with a 5-gallon bucket, if you're feeling really ambitious, if you're incorporating your exercise routine with your watering practices, possibly. But those big trees have big root systems. And actually, while we're talking about it, I want to just share my screen here, because I have a couple of pictures to show you that are perfect illustrations of what we're talking about here.
Well, and I think it'd matter how many mature trees you have, because one would be tough, but if you had 20, well,
that's a full-time winter project right there.
Right.
Sure. So let me just fast forward here. Maybe it was there it is. So here's your mature spruce trees, right? A 5-gallon bucket to go out and water these trees is probably not a very good approach, not a sustainable approach. I put this picture in here because neither is a drip line. I see trees like this planted in a windrow, something like that, where when the trees were planted, there was a drip line installed to water that drip row. And now that these trees are, 20, 30 feet tall, and those root systems have expanded immensely, that drip line running down the length of that tree row, even that's not going to provide enough water for these trees. And that's a pretty common problem I see with evergreens in Wyoming, not getting sufficient water.
So a drip hose is probably great to start with to get them established, but not good for long term. What would be?
So here's an example of a drip system used for to water young trees. These are apple trees that I planted in a specialty crop research project, and instead of running that drip line down the length of the row, I actually made these drip rings around the tree so that we would water the whole root system. And I used blank line in between the trees, so I'm not wasting water by watering in between the rows at this point. This can work for young trees because the root system is small, it's pretty confined. And so watering like this, you can wet the entire root zone of the tree. But as those trees age and mature, this drip system will become insufficient. We could possibly add more and bigger rings around the trees, but most likely at some point you'd switch over to an overhead irrigation sprinkler system.
So Chris, in 25 years from now, when you're still working on this research project, you will be changing the irrigation system.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I know this is temporary, but it's been really successful actually in keeping these trees watered. And so I'm not dragging 5-gallon buckets around, right?
Are you watering these in the wintertime, or
I leave the system out year round, and it just attaches. I've got timers that I use to run it in the summer, but over the winter we'll disconnect and run a hose from the hydrant and connect it into this drip line. So again, on those 40-degree days when the snow's melted, I'll go out. My goal is to go out and water once a month. That doesn't always happen.
What is the diameter of that brown pipe?
That's 1/2 inch. It's 1/2 inch, and it has emitters built into it every 12 inches that put out about a gallon of water per hour per emitter. And so I know that each of these trees has 13 emitters on it. If I let the water run for an hour, I know each tree is basically getting 13 gallons of water per hour. So it also helps you kind of gauge, how much water you're putting out. If you know how much output your water system can provide, in terms of gallons per minute, you can calculate, how many of these tree rings can I supply water to before I have to split it into different zones.
Is this product available locally?
So I order this online actually, but it's pretty common. It's commonly used in landscapes and garden, vegetable fruit production as well. So I order from, I don't know if I'm allowed to say where I order from, but if you don't mind.
Sure, why not?
I order it from the Drip Store. I think it's called thedripstore.com online, an online retailer, but you can get it from a number of retailers and irrigation suppliers. It's pretty easy to work with. I just use a pair of hand pruners to cut the line, and then the fittings, your T connections and couplers to connect those rings and run line to connect the system all together. But basically you need a pair of, sharp pruners, the fittings, the irrigation line, and some stakes to hold it in the ground.
And this is a hard hose. It's not a drip tape.
It's not like a soaker hose or a drip tape. It's a solid, it's flexible, bendable pipe, but it just puts water out through the emitters.
And the drip tape, this hose stays a hose the whole time. It doesn't flatten out like drip tape does once the water pressure's out, correct?
Right. It's round.
Yeah. But you had to build the circles and build the system from all the pieces that was shipped to you, essentially.
Sure. Okay. So, you'll get a 500-foot coil of drip line, and you pull it out. And in this case, I would count the emitters. There's 8 emitters in the big ring. There's 4 in the small ring, and that little connector piece right here, there's 1 emitter in that. So there's my 13 emitters.
So one of the benefits about using this type of product is that it won't blow around in the wind. Drip tape generally will blow. So
no, I've been a big fan of this. I learned how to use this product when I was doing an internship in college at the Chinese garden in Portland, Oregon. And that's what they use to install to water all of their trees and shrubs in the garden. And then since then, I've found lots of uses for it. I use it, in my apple trees. I use the same product. This is my raspberry patch. I'm kind of going backwards here actually, but here's a closer picture showing the wet spots in the ground show you where the emitters are. My raspberry plants that we're sticking in the ground here to water. So in this case, I didn't put a ring around each plant, but I ran the line down both sides of the row and used weed fabric in between to help keep the weeds down. And then mulch is also important too, to help conserve that water. But drip systems, pretty easy to work with, and they make watering a lot more effective and efficient. So here's again, those raspberries before the weed fabric was installed. This is a different system. This was a soaker hose, a little 1/4 inch micro tubing soaker hose that I used in my backyard garden. So this is actually the vegetable garden from my backyard a couple years ago. Just sorting through pictures. I didn't want to show you all of I tried to pick the best one.
So
even though you don't see any red tomatoes. No, I tried to pick the best one, but I couldn't find one with any red tomatoes, unfortunately.
So maybe there are some folks who are watching who might not know the difference between a soaker hose and a drip hose or drip tape. Can you explain the differences between those two?
Sure. So I mean, the idea is kind of the same in that the water is going straight to the soil, to the and to the roots of the plants, and we're keeping water off of the foliage. And then we're also not throwing like an overhead irrigation system, throwing water up into the air where some of that water blows off or evaporates. So drip irrigation systems are very efficient in terms of water use because they direct the water right to the soil, to the roots, and then can help prevent plant diseases because they're keeping the water off the foliage of the plants. But the difference between like a soaker hose and a drip tape or the drip line that I was showing you. So this type of soaker hose, which is the thin black lines you see running down my planting rows, it's kind of a permeable product. It's some sort of a plastic material, polymer material. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but water soaks through the entire hose just very slowly. So you turn the water on and the water pressure pushes the water out through the pores and it just slowly comes out of the drip line through the entire hose.
And it's really not easy to calibrate how much water you're delivering.
No, it's not. It really isn't. You're kind of guessing. Yeah.
So you turn it on, it soaks the ground, you turn it off, you wait till the ground dries up and then soak it again kind of concept?
Pretty much. And you can sort of gauge how deep you're wetting the soil. And that's kind of what I do with these rather than try to calibrate or guess how much water it's actually putting out. Is I'll take a screwdriver or something like that and poke it down into the ground, and it'll go easily down through the wet, moistened soil. But when you hit the dry soil, it'll stop. So that can help you gauge the depth that you're wetting. So you kind of get a feel for it to let it run for 15 minutes or 30 minutes or, depending on your soil and your system.
So what type of plants would work really well for a soaker hose?
Well, I think any plants that you can use a soaker hose for, you could use any of these drip systems for one. But typically I'll use these in my vegetable garden. The thing I don't like about the soaker hose versus the brown tubing is that the soaker hose probably has a lifespan of about a year or two, or a season or two. The soil particles will start to clog it up. The hardness of the water might start to clog up the soaker hose. So, and I've had on my apple trees, they've been out in the ground for, this will be their 4th summer. So the lifespan of that product is a little bit longer. I haven't had any issues with that.
Speaking of trees, we had a comment from Kelly on Facebook Live. She was saying watering new trees over the winter is so important, worth those 5-gallon bucket runs. And she says she does it about once a month.
And she's probably in a lot better shape than I am.
New trees that way, it's a good idea. But the mature ones, probably not.
Chris, we got a question from Krista, and her question is, what time of day is best for irrigating using a soaker hose or drip system?
So the times of day, so when you think about watering, you want to think about, well, it's a natural resource, right? And so we want to be good stewards of our natural resources. So we want to water effectively and efficiently. So times to avoid watering are when it's windy, when it's hot and dry. So those are times when we lose water to evaporation or water blows off in the air, particularly with overhead irrigation. With drip systems, the wind doesn't really affect it But time of day certainly can. So I would say the cooler parts of the day, just so we're losing less water to evaporation. But that said, I've been known to turn my drip system on at, when I come home for lunch, and I'll water the garden because it looks dry and let it run while I eat, and then I'll go back to work. So, it might be one of those things, do as I say, not as I do.
That's one of the benefits of a drip system, is that you can turn them on when they are windy, when it is windy outside, and you're not losing water to the environment if you were using an overhead or a ground spraying type of watering
sprinkler system. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're not losing as much water, right? And I would throw in there, and maybe Chris, you haven't touched on this yet, but these are a good system. You could even set up to a timer as well, if you have that ability.
So yeah, and you can actually find timers now that attach to the end of a hose, attached to the hydrant, and so you don't have to have an expensive automatic irrigation system. You can go buy a $10 or $20 timer that'll work just fine, running off of a 9-volt battery.
Yep.
And I think the big thing, I think, is convenience for you, right? So if you don't have that timer, you got to water when you're there and able to turn it on, turn it off. So at lunch, sometimes it's not ideal, but that's when you're available to irrigate, right?
Sure.
And so you got to do it around your schedule too. But you're saying the cooler. Do I want to water in the middle of the night, maybe at midnight or 1, if I did have that timer?
So you could definitely do that, particularly if you're maybe on a well where you don't want to run the irrigation water the same time you're doing the laundry and the dishes and cooking dinner and all of that stuff, because you have a limited water supply. So maybe the middle of the night when you're not doing those things is the best time to water, so you don't run into those sort of supply limitations. So, watering at night, yeah, absolutely. And timers, the other thing is that you can sort of set it and forget it. It won't forget unless the battery runs out, right? So you can, they can.
The Ron Popeil method of irrigating: set it and forget it.
But don't do that. Do go out and check on your sprinkler systems, even if you do have a timer. Let them run for 5 or 10 minutes to make sure there's no geyser somewhere,
right,
that sprung a leak. And then that prevents the plants further down the line from getting water.
So what would cause it to have a hole in it, or a geyser, as you called it? What would cause that in the tube?
Rodents.
Yeah, tools, shovels, hose, while you're out there weeding, things like that, a weed whacker. But yeah, a critter could chew through that material. The fittings can actually blow out on these if you have too high of a water pressure. So you can put a pressure reducer on there if you notice that, or just not crank up the water so high when you turn the water on.
So speaking
but I haven't had any geysers really with this drip line.
Speaking of water pressure, how do folks know what kind of water pressure they have and kind of gauge it, whether they need a reducer, and what is a reducer?
Sure. So there's a non-scientific approach here, Jenny, which is you install the drip irrigation system, attach it to your water source, and turn the water on. If the couplers and the connecting pieces don't blow out, you don't have too much pressure. If they do, you have too much pressure.
Seems practical.
So there are devices that you can purchase to measure water pressure, but what most people should do instead of that is actually measure your water output. So you turn your hose on and let it run into a 5-gallon bucket and time it for 30 seconds. You can figure out how many gallons per minute your water source can provide. And then that will help you decide how much water you can provide to an irrigation system like this. So for these raspberries, I've got 110 plants here. and there's an emitter every 12 inches that's putting out a gallon per water of water per hour. How many feet of line do I have here total? And then that's the number of emitters I have. Can I put out 500 gallons of water per minute or per hour? Possibly, but I have to know my system in order to know that. And everybody's system is going to be a little bit different. If you're on city water, it'd be pretty consistent, but if you're out in the country, but if you don't measure it, you're guessing. And I think that's what a lot of people do is, and particularly with their lawns, is they turn the water on and, I want to put an inch of water down. Well, how long does it take to put an inch of water down? It's a guess unless you actually go out and measure that.
I like those comments, Chris. That's constantly what I get phone calls about with clientele or who I talk to. And the number one question seems to be, well, how long should I irrigate for? Or how long should I let it run? I don't know. There's not a magic number. It really depends on your system. But what does matter is how much can you put down in a set amount of time.
Right.
And go out and measure that or calculate it like you can with a drip tape.
So with the drip tape, yeah, you can calculate that. With a lawn sprinkler like this, or really any type of lawn sprinkler, you can measure that using what we call a catch can test. So you raid the cabinets and find all the plastic Tupperware containers you can, or the cat food dishes, small containers like that, and you maybe put 5 or 10 of them out in the yard and turn the sprinkler on and set a timer. And how long does it take to fill those containers up with a half an inch or an inch of water? Then okay, it takes 15 minutes or 20 minutes. But again, without doing that, you're just guessing.
Right. So where would sprinkler or overhead irrigation be appropriate?
So basically for watering larger areas, lawns, mature trees, if we're talking about landscapes, that's where I use my sprinklers. So I'll have this is my setup in my backyard. Here we are watering in the middle of the day when you're not supposed to. So I have a sprinkler on the end of a hose that I drag around, and I have done the catch can test, and I know that it takes about 10 minutes to put an inch of water down. So every 10 minutes, I move that hose, or I move that sprinkler head to water my lawn. And if I want to water the trees, I'll let it run and the lawn. I'll let it run for an extra 5 or 10 minutes to provide the extra water for the trees as well.
Go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So if I have fruit trees, do those require more water than ornamental trees or any of that?
Fruit trees do require regular water, absolutely. So it depends on your ornamental trees. Some ornamentals do require more water than others as well. But absolutely, if you're growing fruit trees, regular irrigation is required.
Great.
I liked your example with the screwdriver. I've used that a lot in my lawn to figure out how far the water is going down into the turf roots. And it's been really useful and easy to do quickly.
So I think one of the other things that's interesting to think about in terms of watering, and I'll use the 1 inch example again. So there's different ways to put an inch of water down too. You could water for 20 minutes or whatever and put an inch of water down at one time, or you could put a half an inch of water down twice a week, or you could put a 1/7 of an inch of water down if you watered every day. But you'd put the same amount of water down per week at 1 inch, but the difference is how wet or how deep did we wet that soil profile. when we irrigated. And so when it comes to lawns and watering for trees, I would say water more deeply and less frequently. And what that does is it wets the soil profile further or deeper, which encourages your lawn to grow deeper roots, which helps improve the drought tolerance of your lawn. If we water and wet just the surface, the roots tend to stay and grow shallow, and the top portion of the soil profile, the surface, is going to dry out first. So that means we're going to have to water more frequently in order to keep those plants green and growing and provide the water that they need. But deeper rooted plants can pull water and nutrients from a larger pool of resources if they're rooted deeper into the soil. So I think that's another thing that people should keep in mind is in terms of, how we water. I mean, you don't want to flood the place out. If you see standing water, right, you're putting too much water down at one time. But if you can put, say, an inch of water down without water running off, I think that's better to do once a week than put 1/7 of an inch of water down 7 days a week.
Right. I guess I think of it like you have said, Chris. For my lawn, that's probably an ideal type of irrigation schedule. Maybe with my trees, right? Really soaking that soil down and then letting it dry out a little bit between irrigation sets. And when I say dry out, I mean in the soil profile, underneath the soil where we can't see. Let that dry down a little bit and then soak it again. And so it might be irrigate once a week, maybe twice a week. Just depends on our soil type, probably. But in a garden setting, does that really work well where I can irrigate my garden once and leave it? Or is it better to maybe be more frequent with my irrigations and less amount at that time?
So yeah, good question. And yeah, I think especially in a garden where you're growing food, fruits and vegetables, any drought stress that you experience or those plants experience in your garden is going to decrease their productivity. And so regular watering is going to be, key to success, to maximizing yields and getting the most out of your garden. And so typically, like, I'll water my lawn once a week, my bluegrass lawn here and the south facing in my backyard. My front yard is fine fescues, and it's a little more drought tolerant, but it's also growing in the shade, so not quite as much intense sunlight. And I'll water that maybe twice a month. So it gets about half the water in my bluegrass lawn too. So it can also depend on the species you're growing for your lawn, but bluegrass will require a significantly more amount of water than a fine fescue lawn will. And tall fescue is going to be like somewhere in between a fine fescue and a Kentucky bluegrass lawn in terms of water needs. But you can also get away with a little bit of drought stress in your lawn as long as it's not prolonged, right? That just means you didn't have to mow it as often. And so maybe in that situation, that's, working smarter and not harder. But in your vegetable garden, you don't want to skip a harvest, right? So you keep the water, on those plants.
Well, and probably as a general rule of thumb, our annual plants, very much like our vegetable gardens and that, don't have the extensive root system, right? They could use that smaller watering closer to the surface, so to speak, than our perennial plants like trees and lawns that have deeper roots that can grab that soil moisture a little bit deeper in the water and tolerate that deeper watering. Is that a good comparison, Chris?
Yeah, that's perfect, Jeremiah. You hit the nail on the head. Those annual plants in our garden, kind of like those young trees that I showed you that the drip line would work for, but not those mature trees, because that those annual plants, the roots are very confined, and you know right where they're at. They haven't spread out too far beyond where you planted them. So you can direct that water right to them, putting on, you know, water right to the plants, and watering frequently enough that it's not drying out or causing any drought stress in between.
We got a question here, Chris, from Brandy, and it's just a timely question, but her question is, do all vegetables need the same amount of water, or how do I know who or what needs how much water?
Sure, good question. Yeah, there are some vegetables that will require more than others. So in terms of timing, the critical time to provide water to your plants is when they're flowering and fruiting. I mean, they're going to need water, you know, irrigation water from the day you plant them till you're done harvesting them. But the critical time is really between flower production and then the ripening of the fruit and harvest, because that's when it's critical to the development of those fruits and what you're harvesting from the garden. So focus on making sure you provide water to those plants when they're producing fruit. And then, but just in general terms, you know, like I'm trying to think of a drought tolerant vegetable actually and coming up blank. But, you know, root crops tend to be pretty easy, and maybe a little more forgiving. So carrots and potatoes, things like that, beets and radishes, are going to be a little more forgiving than, say, your tomatoes and giant pumpkins and things like that.
Celery's not very forgiving either. It likes to be moist. Otherwise, yeah, it gets woody and tough. So celery's a little bit more of a challenge.
But yeah, you know, and that's one of the challenges with vegetable gardening, is that every plant seemingly has its own set of needs, and so you do your best to maybe group those plants together so that we can water maybe one section of the garden heavier than the others as needed. But you know, you do your best to sort of balance that out based on the plant's needs.
So now, when you're talking about grouping those plants, Chris, you're talking maybe grouping all the root crops close together so they can be irrigated similar, and leafy greens in the same area, and maybe the fruit crops in the same area, like tomatoes and eggplant. Is that what you mean by grouping, or is there a different type of grouping?
That's exactly what I try to do. And that way also you can, when you're done harvesting your lettuce, but your tomatoes are still going, maybe you can just turn the drip system off for that section of the garden that you finished harvesting, and or divide it into zones so that you can water those separately when they're growing together at the same time.
So if I understand right, there are differences in irrigation per species, maybe, or per family of plants, vegetable plants, or whatever plant you're talking about. Where would somebody, if they really wanted to nerd out on this, Chris, where would I go to find that resource and kind of understand that a little bit more, of which ones are a little more of a water hog versus another?
Sure. Well, one of the places, just for general information, you know, the back of the seed packet, a lot of times they will indicate water needs. Sometimes they'll call plants like heavy feeders. That might mean that they need additional or supplemental fertilizer as well. They might say they're thirsty plants. So if you hear comments or see things like that, that's an indicator, okay, we need to water these a lot, and be diligent about it. But so one of my favorite vegetable gardening resources is just called the Vegetable Gardening Handbook. It's an old publication. I don't have it sitting here with me, but let me, at the end of our conversation, I'll find it and put a link into the chat box if I can.
And we can post it to the website too afterwards so people can find it. But yeah, that'd be great.
But when it comes to like flowers and ornamentals, there's like other resources where folks can look up that kind of information. Like if they do Google or something for water-wise flowers and stuff like that, they can pull up information, including on our Barnyards and Backyards site under the landscaping page. There's sections that list different plants, including a lot of extension publications that talk about different perennials and how much moisture that they need.
All valuable resources that everybody wants to have. But yeah, I think we got a good understanding of that. One thing that we haven't talked about, and I don't want to steer the conversation too far away if you had other thoughts, Chris, but one thing we haven't talked about is how does soil type affect or play a part of the variables with irrigation? Can you speak to that? How do I know? What do I do?
Sure. So just in general terms, a sandy soil is going to take up water faster than a heavy clay soil. So I think some of the terminology that people use when they talk about a heavy soil, they're typically saying or talking about a clay soil. And heavy soils, clay soils, they have smaller particle sizes and smaller pore spaces, which means water infiltrates those pore spaces slower than sand, which is a more coarse material. Water flows more freely through it. So in terms of watering, that means that we can put more water down on a sandy soil without losing water to runoff or seeing standing pooling water when we're irrigating. Heavy or clay soils, we might have to reduce the amount of water or slow the amount of water we're putting down if the soil isn't taking it up as fast as our sprinklers are putting the water down. So that's a case where, like, if you have a sandy soil, yeah, you could put an inch of water down at one time, probably no problem. But if you had a clay soil, you might break that up into 2 waterings just to prevent that pooling and water runoff. So yeah, soil can play a big part in how much water you can put down and how that water is taken up. So can the contour of the land. So, flat land versus a hillside, and watering on a slope can be challenging too. So think about where you're planting trees and things like that. How are you going to get that water to stay there and not just run down the hill? But how do you direct it to those tree roots? So those are other challenges that we run into as well.
Chris,
Right.
we had a question on Facebook that goes back to where you had the circles of irrigation hose around the young trees. Teresa asked, was the pipe between the emitter rounds the same material as the circle, or was it a harder, stiffer type of hose?
It's the exact same hose, but it does not have the emitters installed. It's called a blank line or a blank hose.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it just allows you to, so I don't need to water, I don't need to water in between these trees right now. So no point in doing that.
So no weeds.
Well,
less weeds.
Less weeds. One of the
Not as
benefits
big.
One of the benefits of drip irrigation is that you're putting water where you need it, so that if it's your intention to reduce the number of weeds that you have, and you can put the water where you need it, then you will have fewer weeds.
Yeah.
If you're not overhead sprinkling those types of things, you're not promoting the germination and growth of those weeds. So that is another benefit of drip.
Yeah, and speaking of, look at this picture here, Jeff. So I lost a few of my raspberries. And yeah, imagine where are those weeds growing? Right under the drip line.
Yep.
So not surprising.
I had noticed that earlier when you showed that picture.
Yeah. So these raspberry plants, we ordered them last year. They came in April, and bare root. And then of course we had snow on June 23rd. So I had potted them up and kept them alive on my patio in my backyard. I had pretty good success, but this particular variety is heritage, and I think I lost 7 out of the 10 plants on that variety. So that's my empty row here. But anyway, yeah, your point about drip irrigation is, I agree 100%. When you start watering an area like this with an overhead sprinkler system, it's going to become a weed patch. So it was a weed patch before we planted it, which is why it's bare soil in this photograph. We did our best to eradicate the weeds, and then we planted like a grass wildflower mix ground cover in between the trees. So we still had quite a few weeds come in, but we did intentionally plant back a seed mix.
That comment just triggered another thought for me, Chris, and a question that I get often from clientele is, they have a landscape, maybe not quite like your orchard, but where we have lawn underneath of deciduous trees in the yard. And how do we irrigate for both of those?
So here's my front yard. This is similar to what you just described. And so this is the north side of my house. We've got 2 big cottonwood trees, and mostly lawn, and some shrubs that we've started to plant and landscape around the front of the house. So I use the sprinkler that I showed you in the backyard to water the lawn and these trees. These cottonwood trees are about, well, I'm assuming they're as old as the house, about 60 years old. And so, I mean, just watering my lawn is not watering the entire root system of these trees. But I use overhead irrigation to water the lawn and the trees. Just keep in mind that if you're watering trees and turf, a good general rule for turf might be 1 inch of water per week. But if you want to water the trees too, add another 1 inch to that. And especially on a mature tree like this, and really soak the ground to make sure that the water is deep enough that it's watering the roots, but it's also getting down to the tree roots as well.
And far enough out from the base where most of the feeder roots are at, right? Beyond the drip line of the tree. So yeah, don't set a sprinkler at the base of your big cottonwood tree and think that you're doing a whole lot of good in terms of watering. Yeah, those feeder roots are going to be out to the drip line of that tree and beyond, and those are the roots that are going to be taking up water and nutrients. The roots at the base of the tree are your anchor roots. Those are your big roots that are holding the tree upright, keeping it from blowing over in the wind and falling under the weight of snow and ice and things like that. And so we've been talking about drip tape and drip line. Drip line reference here means that it's out at the edge of the canopy, correct? Right. Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you for, yeah, the drip zone, we'll call it the drip zone of the tree, is the outer edge of the tree's canopy, where you could imagine if it was raining, the raindrops would be dripping off of the leaves in the drip zone. So I had that question, and you've touched on it a bit, Chris, is how do I know how far those roots extend underneath of a tree? So a good rule is roots can extend 2 to 3 times the height of the tree. So if you've got a 50-foot tree, those roots could potentially extend 100 to 150 feet out from the trunk. Wow. And that's probably dependent on species, but that's a good rule of thumb. That's a good rule of thumb. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't apply to everything, but it's a good, general rule. And whether or not your house is in the way.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
so clearly, yes, our house has obstructed the growth of those roots at some point, right? And so has our neighbors.
We
So if
have a
there's nothing,
question on Zoom. I don't know if you know the answer to it. Angela asked, does Wyoming have anything like the Utah Localscape program? Not necessarily the rebates, but classes that might give you a list of types of plants that would work and where to purchase them. I'm not familiar with that program. Perhaps one of you is.
I'm not familiar with that program.
So I'm not familiar with that program either. There are a lot of community-based efforts to replace the tree canopy of a community or something like that. I'm from the Midwest where tornadoes come through occasionally, and so I've seen situations like that where the towns come together and say, we're going to rebuild the canopy, and they start an effort to replace trees that were lost. And I'm guessing it's a similar program or something like that, that's encouraging residents to plant certain types of trees. But as far as programs and resources that are available, one of the things, I guess I'll put a plug in for the Master Gardener program. That it's about 40 hours of classroom training, but it covers everything from trees and lawns and flowers to fruits and vegetables and botany and soils and composting and plant diseases. It's a very in-depth training and program, but we focus all of those trainings on Wyoming and growing and gardening in Wyoming. So it is very specific to Wyoming. It doesn't really venture into the where to buy plants and the retail or wholesale side of things. In that case, I would say support your local garden centers, but also consider shopping online, because you can find a lot of things online, buying bare root plants that maybe you can't find at the local garden center. But the thing that's important to know is your growing zone. So whether you're a zone 3 or 4 or 5 in Wyoming, and then choosing plants that are going to be cold hardy to your area.
So, and if your question had to do with native plants, we have a number of publications on that Barnyard site on the landscaping page that cover different native plants that you can grow that are flowers or trees or perennials in your yard.
Yeah, Jenny, and I agree. I'm with Jeff and Chris on this. I've not heard of that program. I don't know it in depth, but I guess I'd also put a plug in like Chris did for Master Gardeners. Great way to connect. Those gardeners have great experience and some good knowledge to share and resources, but that's what Extension's there for too. That's some of my favorite phone calls really, is people that call in and want recommendations that are best suited for the area. And we got county offices all over, and we'll talk about that. But talk to those local resources. They may be able to point you into those areas. And I can't highlight all of the areas to get those and source those varieties, but certain ones, especially on the grass side of things. So
we have a follow-up question from Brandy. She asks, how do I get into the Master Gardener program?
Well, Brandy, you could contact me. We have just finished up, well, just time's flying, I guess, but we recently finished up our latest training online, and depending on where you're at, there might be an opportunity for a face-to-face Master Gardener training. But my plan is to offer the Master Gardener training online again starting this fall. We'll follow a similar schedule that we did last time, which was September through January. But if you could contact me, send me your or if I had your email address, I could, I'll put you on my list of folks who are interested and keep you posted for the next training opportunity.
Great, and we can probably link that as well on the website page so people can reference that. We have one more question, Chris. So Krista asked, does xeriscaped areas or areas landscaped with native plants still need occasional watering?
So with xeriscape or anything, whether it's a native plant, a drought tolerant plant, anything that would fit into that xeriscape category, you're going to need to water it initially to help it get established, most likely. If you're planting from seed, maybe you planted in the fall and timed it before the snow and you let nature take its course there. But if you're putting transplants into the ground, you're going to help them establish by providing water initially. But then once the plants have established, we can either cut back dramatically, or if they're truly native plants and adapted to our area, we might choose those plants that can survive off of the moisture that Mother Nature provides. Chances are you might have to still water in a landscape situation, maybe once or twice a year. If it's a true xeriscape, drought tolerant type of a landscape. A landscape situation can be different than a native habitat. And so, with roads and sidewalks and houses and driveways and sun reflecting off of that, we can see heat stress and drought stress even on some of the native plants, depending on how they're planted and where they're planted. But you'll water them significantly less.
Yeah, it also depends whether native to. If they're native to along our streams and creeks, then they probably like quite a bit of water compared to others that are on our higher rangelands, which like it dry.
Good point, Jenny. Yeah, just because it's native doesn't necessarily mean it's drought tolerant.
Right. Well, is there any other topics that we didn't cover, Chris, or any other thoughts that that we can offer to people that are just starting to get started in gardening or into landscaping and that in terms of water? Where do I start? What are the 3 easy steps?
As you're wrapping up, can you unshare your screen so that we can see everybody? There you go.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that has stood out to me in the 8, almost 9 years I've been in Wyoming, I was one of those Midwest transplants, and I've met quite a few people that moved to Wyoming from other parts of the country, and people are surprised that you have to water your trees here. I bought my house and 3 years later my cottonwoods died or my spruce trees are died. Well, you have to water here. Just about everything we grow in Wyoming is going to need some water. So don't forget to water your trees. That's maybe one of the things that stands out most to me, but also seeing the winter injury that you see. So this time of the year, you can go out and walk around your neighborhood and probably see signs of drought stress in spruce trees in particular, spruce trees and other evergreens that have needles that have turned brown over the winter. The winter watering can help those trees survive. So if we can provide some winter watering, that's another great recommendation, but don't forget to water your trees.
Just don't neglect to water your things. Everything needs water.
When in doubt.
Right.
One thing we haven't talked about, we mentioned several times drip tape, drip line, soaker hoses, especially in our gardens, but we did not really mention aerial irrigation on gardens. Why? Is there something that we don't want to have with that? Is there a disease component, insect component? Can I do overhead watering? What are your thoughts?
So yeah, if you do overhead irrigation in a vegetable garden, you can invite some disease issues into your garden. So if you do use overhead irrigation, I would say try to do it early in the morning. when it's still cool and the wind hasn't kicked up yet, but the sun will come up and warm things up shortly after, so the water will evaporate and not sit on the foliage for an extended period of time. But another option, if you don't have a drip system, is just hand water. You know, a watering wand on the end of a hose, you can do a pretty good job of watering with that. And again, just directing the water to the base of the plant, keeping it off of the foliage. But yeah, there definitely is a disease component to overhead irrigation, particularly in your vegetable garden.
And if you do overhead irrigation in a garden, if you can, let that canopy dry out before you irrigate again, just trying to reduce that disease pressure.
Yeah, exactly. So time it as best you can, and then the frequency there, do allow it to dry out in between.
Chris, you haven't mentioned anything about water quality in our state. Is there something folks should be aware of along that line?
Sure, good question. If you're on city water, if you live in town, there's probably no issues that would be unique to you. You know, if there was a city water issue, we would all know about that. But if you're on a well, there can be problems with water quality in Wyoming. Help me out here, you guys. But I think it's salts. Are there heavy metals as well? But I'm thinking it's mainly salt issues that well water will run into.
Generally not heavy metals. It's usually salts or other mineral, hard water situations.
Heavy calcium and that.
Yeah.
Yep. And especially in a drip line or drip tape irrigation system, those emitters will get plugged with that heavy calcium, and that can be an issue. But yeah, I think salts is probably your larger concern.
And if you are concerned, because salty irrigation water will not, your vegetable garden will not respond well to that. Neither will your lawn or your trees and shrubs or any other plants that you irrigate with that water. So if you are concerned with the water quality, there are testing facilities. I know Colorado State, their soils lab will do a water analysis. They're currently closed or taking limited orders due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But typically we would say, have your water tested to ensure that there aren't high salts.
Yeah, and there's some analytical labs in the state that could do that water testing, like IML labs, Energy Labs, Ward Labs out of Nebraska also does soil and water sampling. So there's multiple labs available, I think, for the water quality side of things.
Sure.
Great. Well, anything else, guys, before we wrap up? I don't see any questions in the chat box or anything. So I think with that, I think we'll close it, Chris. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us on this.
Well, thanks for hosting and the invitation. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Jenny, she's beat me to it.
She's on the way.
Yeah. Well, for everybody out there, for those wanting to connect, we've referenced it several times. The Barnyards and Backyards website. Jenny has pulled up on the screen here the URL to get to that Barnyards and Backyards website. On there, we have a list of future shows coming up. Right now, we're Wednesday and Friday at 10 a.m. So look for the next one coming up. Also, for a show like this one we're just finishing up, we have recorded it. We're going to post it up on that website. And then a lot of the materials that we have referenced and anything that in terms of resources, we're going to post back up on that website so you can find it and hopefully make it easy for you. The next thing is connect with your local extension office, right? We have county extension offices in every county of Wyoming and one on the Wind River Indian Reservation. And so connect with those folks, especially when we talked about finding and sourcing plant materials that are maybe native to the area or really good for the local area. That's a great great resource to have to start that search and to find other resources. So connect with those local extension offices when you can. The last thing we want to mention is we want to hear from you. I think Jenny posted the Survey Monkey for the evaluation in the comments section of Facebook Live. For those that are joining us via Zoom, we have an evaluation that will prompt in the internet browser when you close out. So if you'd please take a minute, give us some feedback. We really appreciate all the feedback we've received so far, and we've tried to tailor and adjust to those comments, so we really appreciate it. With that, everybody, you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody,
Bye.
for joining us.
Thanks again, Chris.
Thank you.